The family portrait looked ordinary. 15 men and women gathered in a Brooklyn restaurant's private dining room in August 1931, posed around a long table covered with white linen, celebrating what appeared to be a wedding anniversary. The men wore dark suits, the women elegant dresses with the modest hemlines fashionable in that era. Wine glasses glinted in the soft light, and plates of untouched food suggested the photographer had interrupted the meal at just the right moment. Everything about the image projected warmth, prosperity, and the kind of family unity that Italian immigrants worked their entire lives to achieve. But when FBI agent Richard Castellano examined the photograph in 1985 as part of a historical review of organized crime documentation, he noticed something that made him reach for the phone immediately. Standing in the back row, partially obscured by two other men, was a face that should have been impossible. The face of Tommy Lucchese, photographed at a family gathering 6 weeks before he would help orchestrate the murder of the man sitting at the head of the table. The photograph had been seized during a 1972 raid on the home of Michael Benedetto, a low-level associate of the Genovese crime family. It had been filed with dozens of other family photographs and personal documents, considered unremarkable at the time. The raid had focused on bookmaking operations, not historical evidence, and the photograph had languished in an FBI storage facility for 13 years before the agency began digitizing and cataloging old case materials. Richard had been assigned to review photographs from the early 1930s as part of a project documenting the formation of the 5 families following the Castellamarese War. He had spent weeks looking at surveillance photos, mugshots, and crime scene images. But this family photograph was different, informal, intimate, the kind of image that showed mobsters as human beings rather than criminals. The man at the head of the table was immediately recognizable, Salvatore Maranzano, who in August 1931 had declared himself capo di tutti I capi, boss of all bosses, after orchestrating the murder of his rival Joe Masseria. Maranzano sat with the confident bearing of someone who believed he had won, his expression calm and authoritative as he presided over what appeared to be a celebration in his honor. But Richard's attention was drawn to a man standing in the back row, slightly out of focus, positioned between two other guests in a way that suggested he had been added to the group at the last moment. The face was partially obscured by shadow, but Richard had studied enough photographs of 1930s mobsters to recognize him immediately. Tommy Lucchese, who would later become boss of one of the 5 families. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, Maranzano Anniversary Dinner, August 15, 1931. May this peace last forever. Richard calculated the dates. This photograph had been taken less than 4 weeks before Maranzano's assassination on September 10, 1931. And Tommy Lucchese, the man who wasn't supposed to be there, had been one of the key figures who helped Lucky Luciano arrange that murder. Richard pulled every file the FBI had on the Castellamarese War and Maranzano's assassination. The historical record was clear. After defeating Joe Masseria in April 1931, Salvatore Maranzano had reorganized New York's Italian criminal gangs into 5 families and declared himself the supreme authority over all of them. He held a meeting in Wappingers Falls, New York, where he announced his new structure and demanded tribute payments from the other bosses. But Maranzano's reign lasted only 5 months. By late August 1931, Lucky Luciano and other younger mobsters had grown tired of Maranzano's old-world Sicilian traditions and his insistence on absolute authority. Maranzano, sensing the threat, had put Luciano and several of his allies on a hit list. But Luciano struck first, sending 4 Jewish gunmen disguised as federal agents to Maranzano's office on September 10th, where they shot and stabbed him to death. What made the assassination possible was inside information. Tommy Lucchese, who was officially Maranzano's lieutenant, had secretly alerted Luciano that Maranzano was planning to kill him. Lucchese had even been present in Maranzano's office that day, pointing out which man was the boss so the hitmen would know who to kill. Richard stared at the photograph. If this had been taken on August 15, 1931, it meant that Tommy Lucchese had been socializing with Maranzano at a family celebration less than a month before helping to orchestrate his murder. He had stood in that room, smiling for the camera, breaking bread with a man he knew he would soon betray. But something else bothered Richard. Why was Lucchese in the photograph at all? Historical accounts described him as Maranzano's lieutenant, someone who worked closely with the boss. But this wasn't a business meeting. This appeared to be a personal celebration, an anniversary dinner for Maranzano and his wife. The presence of women in the formal table setting suggested an intimate family occasion, not a gathering of criminal associates. Richard examined the other faces in the photograph, cross-referencing them with FBI files from the period. He identified several other men who had been known associates of Maranzano's organization. Joe Profaci, who would later head one of the 5 families, Joe Bonanno, another future boss, and several captains and soldiers who had survived the Castellamarese War. But mixed among them were people who appeared to have no connection to organized crime, women who might have been wives or relatives, older men who looked like family patriarchs rather than gangsters. This was a photograph that blurred the line between family and organization, between personal celebration and business alliance. And standing in the back, partially hidden, was the man who would destroy it all. Had Lucchese been invited as a trusted lieutenant? Or had he inserted himself into this gathering to gather intelligence on Maranzano's movements and relationships? Richard contacted Dr. Vincent Romano, a historian who had written extensively about the Castellamarese War and the formation of the commission. When Richard sent him high-resolution scans of the photograph, Vincent's response came within hours. "This is extraordinary. We've never had photographic evidence of the relationship between Maranzano and Lucchese before the assassination. This changes our understanding of how the betrayal unfolded." They met at Vincent's office at Columbia University 2 days later. Vincent had spread out dozens of documents across his desk. Police reports, newspaper clippings, FBI surveillance logs from 1931. The traditional narrative, he explained, is that Lucchese was a reluctant participant in Maranzano's murder. "We've believed that he only betrayed Maranzano after learning that Maranzano planned to kill Luciano and others." Vincent pointed to the photograph. "But this suggests something different. If Lucchese was close enough to Maranzano to be invited to a family anniversary celebration, it means the betrayal went deeper than we thought. This wasn't a lieutenant turning on a boss he barely knew. This was someone who had been welcomed into Maranzano's inner circle, someone who had earned his trust, and then used that trust to destroy him." Richard had tracked down the provenance of the photograph. It had belonged to Michael Benedetto, whose grandfather had been one of Maranzano's bodyguards in 1931. According to family records, the grandfather, Carmine Benedetto, had been present at the anniversary dinner and had kept several photographs from that evening. Richard found Carmine Benedetto's FBI file. He had been questioned after Maranzano's assassination but claimed to know nothing about who had planned the hit. He had survived the purge that followed Maranzano's death, eventually becoming a soldier in the Genovese family. He died in 1968, taking whatever he knew about that night to his grave. But Richard found something else in the file, a notation from a 1952 interview in which Benedetto had mentioned the anniversary dinner where we should have known something was wrong. When asked to elaborate, Benedetto had clammed up and refused to say more. Vincent suggested they try to identify everyone in the photograph more precisely. They spent days comparing faces to known photographs of Maranzano's organization from that period. They identified 14 of the 15 people in the image. But one man, standing in the far back corner, his face almost completely in shadow, remained unidentifiable. "Whoever he is," Vincent said, studying the shadowy figure, "he's positioned himself so we can barely see him. That's not an accident. That's someone who didn't want to be in this photograph but couldn't avoid it entirely. Was there a second informant in that room? Someone else who had already made the decision to betray Maranzano and was hiding in plain sight?" Vincent discovered a crucial document in the National Archives, a confidential FBI memo from 1932, written by an agent who had been investigating Maranzano's assassination. The memo had been declassified in the 1980s, but had received little attention from researchers. FBI Memorandum, March 15, 1932. Investigation into the September 10, 1931. Murder of Salvatore Maranzano has revealed that the conspiracy to eliminate him was more extensive than initially believed. While Charles Luciano is widely credited with organizing the hit, informants indicate that at least 3 of Maranzano's own lieutenants were aware of the plot weeks before it occurred and did nothing to warn him. One informant states that Tommy Lucchese attended a personal dinner at Maranzano's residence in mid-August 1931, approximately 3 weeks before the assassination. The informant claims Lucchese appeared nervous and distracted throughout the evening, and that he left earlier than other guests. When questioned about his demeanor, Lucchese allegedly told associates that he had stomach troubles and needed to leave. The memo aligned perfectly with the photograph dated August 15, 1931. Richard and Vincent realized they were looking at documentation of the very dinner described in the FBI report. Vincent found additional evidence in a collection of oral histories recorded in the 1960s with elderly members of New York's Italian-American community. One interview, conducted in 1967 with a woman named Rosa Benedetto, Carmine's wife, contained a remarkable passage. Interview excerpt. Rosa Benedetto, June 1967. I remember that dinner very well. It was supposed to be a celebration for Mr. Maranzano and his wife. My husband was invited because he worked closely with Mr. Maranzano. The dinner was beautiful. The food, the wine, everything was first class. But there was tension in the room that I couldn't understand at the time. There was a man there, Tommy they called him, who seemed out of place. Not because he wasn't dressed well or didn't know how to behave, but because he kept looking at his watch, looking at the door, like he wanted to be anywhere but there. My husband noticed it too. After the dinner on the way home, he said to me, "That Tommy fellow is going to cause trouble, mark my words." 3 weeks later, Mr. Maranzano was dead. And when my husband heard the news, he didn't seem surprised. He just said, I told you Tommy was going to cause trouble." I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't explain. He never spoke about it again. Rosa's testimony confirmed what the photograph suggested. Tommy Lucchese had been present at Maranzano's anniversary dinner, and his discomfort had been noticeable enough that guests had commented on it. But why had Lucchese attended if he already knew he was going to betray Maranzano? Was he gathering intelligence, or was he struggling with the burden of what he knew was coming? Richard found the answer in an unexpected place: the personal papers of Meyer Lansky, the Jewish mobster who had provided the gunman for Maranzano's assassination. Lansky's papers had been donated to a private archive after his death, and among them was a handwritten note dated August 20th, 1931, just 5 days after the anniversary dinner. Lansky's note, August 20th, 1931. Met with Charlie Luciano and Tommy Lucchese today. Charlie is ready to move against the old man Maranzano, but Tommy is having doubts. He says Maranzano has treated him well, trusted him, brought him into his family circle. Tommy attended a dinner at Maranzano's home last week and says it made him realize how personal this is. We're not just removing a boss, we're destroying a man who considers some of us friends. Charlie told Tommy that sentimentality has no place in business. He reminded Tommy that Maranzano has already put us on a list, that we're dead men if we don't move first. Tommy agreed, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knows what needs to be done, but he doesn't like it. The note revealed something crucial. Tommy Lucchese hadn't been a coldly calculating betrayer. He had been torn between loyalty to Maranzano, who had elevated him and trusted him, and survival instinct that told him Maranzano's old world rules would get them all killed. Vincent located testimony from the 1963 Valachi hearings, where Joseph Valachi, a Mafia informant, had discussed the events of 1931. Buried in hundreds of pages of testimony was a passage about Tommy Lucchese. Valachi testimony, October 1963. Tommy Lucchese was one of the smartest guys I ever knew. But in 1931, when they were planning to hit Maranzano, Tommy almost backed out. See, Maranzano had been good to him. He'd promoted Tommy, given him territory, invited him to family events. Tommy told me years later that going to Maranzano's house for that anniversary dinner was one of the hardest things he ever did. He said he sat there eating Maranzano's food, drinking his wine, listening to him talk about his wife and his plans for the future, and all the while knowing that in a few weeks, Maranzano would be dead because Tommy had chosen Luciano's side. But Tommy also told me that when he got home that night, he found out that Maranzano had added 2 more names to his hit list, names of guys Tommy considered friends, and that's when Tommy knew he'd made the right choice. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about survival. Richard and Vincent examined the photograph one more time, looking at Tommy Lucchese's face, partially obscured, positioned at the edge of the group. his expression unreadable in the poor lighting. "He's standing apart from everyone else," Vincent observed. "Even in a group photograph, he's isolated." He knew he didn't really belong there anymore. The photograph had captured the moment when Tommy Lucchese was simultaneously inside and outside Maranzano's world, present at the celebration but already committed to its destruction. Richard and Vincent presented their findings at a symposium on organized crime history in 1986. The photograph was displayed alongside the documents they had uncovered, creating a narrative that challenged the traditional understanding of Maranzano's assassination. "What this photograph shows us," Vincent said during his presentation, "is that the betrayals that reshaped the American Mafia in 1931 weren't clean, simple affairs. They were deeply personal. Tommy Lucchese didn't betray a distant boss he barely knew. He betrayed a man who had welcomed him into his home, who had trusted him enough to invite him to an intimate family celebration." The photograph generated significant interest among historians and criminologists. Dr. Sarah Romano, who had written extensively about the psychology of organized crime, argued that the image provided rare insight into the emotional complexity of mafia loyalty. "We tend to think of these men as ruthless killers who could switch allegiances without remorse," she wrote in a journal article analyzing the photograph. But Lucchese's visible discomfort at that dinner, documented by witnesses and suggested by his body language in this photograph, shows us that these decisions came with psychological costs. He may have known intellectually that betraying Maranzano was necessary for his survival, but emotionally, he struggled with the violation of trust it represented. The FBI used the photograph in training materials for agents studying organized crime, emphasizing how personal relationships within mafia families often masked the ruthless calculations underneath. This photograph reminds us that organized crime isn't just about violence and money, one training document stated. It's about human relationships, loyalty, betrayal, and the ways people justify their actions to themselves. Richard tracked down several descendants of the people in the photograph. Most were shocked to learn that their grandfathers or great-grandfathers had been present at this dinner just weeks before one of the most significant assassinations in mafia history. One woman, Angela Profaci, whose grandfather Joe Profaci appeared in the photograph, told Richard, "My grandfather never talked about those days. But my grandmother once told me that in 1931, something happened that changed my grandfather forever. She said he came home one night and told her, 'We're in a different world now. The old rules don't apply anymore.'" The photograph was eventually donated to the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, where it remains on permanent display as part of an exhibition on the formation of the Commission. The placard explains the historical context and identifies the key figures, including Tommy Lucchese standing in the back row. Visitors often stand in front of the photograph for long minutes, studying Lucchese's face, trying to read the emotions of a man who knew he was attending a celebration for someone he would soon help murder. The photograph that should never have existed, that documented a betrayer in the midst of those he would betray, had become evidence of the human cost of survival in a world without mercy. Richard stood in the Mob Museum gallery on a quiet afternoon, looking at the photograph one final time before his retirement. 55 years had passed since that August evening in 1931, and everyone in the photograph was long dead. He thought about Salvatore Maranzano, sitting at the head of the table with the confidence of a man who believed he had won. Maranzano had defeated his rival, reorganized the families, declared himself supreme leader. In his mind, the war was over and the future was secure. He had invited his most trusted associates to celebrate with him, never suspecting that one of them had already chosen a different future. He thought about Tommy Lucchese, standing in the back of the photograph, his face partially hidden, his body language suggesting someone who wanted to be anywhere else. History would remember Lucchese as one of the architects of the modern American Mafia, a boss who ruled wisely and died in his bed rather than on a sidewalk. But this photograph captured him at a different moment, as a man trapped between competing loyalties, knowing he had to betray one to survive. And he thought about all the other men in that photograph, most of whom had probably sensed that something was wrong that evening but hadn't understood what it meant. Carmine Benedetto, who told his wife that Tommy was going to cause trouble. The other guests who later remembered an atmosphere of tension beneath the surface celebration. They had all been present at a moment of historical significance without fully understanding it. Vincent had told Richard something during their investigation that had stayed with him. Every photograph is a lie in some sense. It shows us a moment frozen in time, but it can't show us what came before or what comes after. This photograph shows us a celebration, but we know it's actually a funeral. Maranzano just doesn't know he's the corpse yet. The photograph had survived purely by chance. Carmine Benedetto had kept it not because he understood its historical importance, but because it reminded him of a night when he had worn his best suit and eaten at a table with important men. His grandson had inherited it without knowing its significance. The FBI had seized it without realizing what they had. And for 54 years, Tommy Lucchese's face had stared out from that photograph, preserved in the moment when he had stood in a room with a man he was about to help kill, smiling for the camera while carrying the weight of a terrible secret. As Richard turned to leave, he noticed a young couple standing in front of the photograph reading the placard. The woman pointed to Lucchese in the back row. "He knew," she said to her companion. "You can see it in his eyes." He knew. Some secrets can't be hidden, even in photographs meant to project harmony. The truth finds its way to the surface eventually, in the spaces between smiles and the shadows cast by men who know too much.